We welcome you to the Bible study today. Turning your Bibles to the book of Job. We're continuing our study with chapter 4. We'll be looking at the chapter verse by verse today. In verses 1 to 6, Eliphaz commends Job. This chapter follows Job's first discussion, where he spoke of his condition. And now Eliphaz commends Job, breaking the silence. In verses 1 through 6. Verse 1, Then Eliphaz the Temanite answered and said, If one attempts a word with you, will you become weary? But who can withhold himself from speaking? Surely you have instructed many, and you have strengthened weak hands. And so in verses 1 to 6, Eliphaz commends Job. In verse 1, it says, Eliphaz the Temanite answered and said. And so Eliphaz is the first of the three friends to speak, and he begins the first of 3 rounds of these speeches. He's identified as the Temanite in order to distinguish him from other people having the same name. Temanite identifies someone who is a descendant or a resident of this place, Teman. Verse 2, If one attempts a word with you, will you become weary? But who can withhold himself from speaking? Eliphaz appears hesitant to speak at all. He probably should have went with his first instinct, if that was the case. He thinks that Job might become weary with his words. However, Eliphaz could not refrain himself from speaking. He just couldn't help himself. And so he said that Job might become weary. That might be an indication. If you think that your audience is going to become weary at listening, it might not be the best way to start the speech. The term weary is sometimes rendered as impatient in other versions. That's interesting to see the great patience of Job, as we've saw in the previous chapters. And yet here the friend, one of the first things that he says is that Job might become weary or perhaps impatient with him after all that he went through. Verse 3, Surely you have instructed many, and you have strengthened weak hands. Eliphaz commends Job, who instructed and who strengthened many people who were weak. Weak hands, suggesting those who are weak. Job 4, 3-4. Verse 4, Your words have upheld him who was stumbling, and you have strengthened the feeble knees. He spoke of the weak hands, now the feeble knees. Job's words of instruction upheld or supported the one who was stumbling and the one who was feeble. He strengthened the feeble or the bending knees, those that would bend in weakness. And he has strengthened the weak hands, as we saw in verse 3. So this was Job's practice according to Eliphaz, his friend. He did this for other people when they were weak. Verse 5, But now it comes upon you, and you are weary. It touches you, and you are troubled. Eliphaz points out how Job is now the man with the weak hands, verse 3, who is stumbling with the feeble knees, verse 4. And so Eliphaz says, basically, as we might say, the shoe is now on the other foot. And so now Job will have to take his own advice, Eliphaz says. He now needs to be strengthened and to be instructed himself. Verse 6, Is not your reverence, your confidence, and the integrity of your ways, your hope? Eliphaz says that Job's reverence should give him confidence, and that his integrity should give him hope for the future. Eliphaz's advice for Job: Job, take your own advice. The term reverence is also translated fear. For example, Job later speaks of the fear of the Almighty in Job 6 and 14, and also the fear of the Lord in Job 28 and 28. But here we see that Job is first commended by the man, and now he begins his rebuke. In verses 7 to 11, verse 7, remember now, whoever perished being innocent, or where were the upright ever cut off? Eliphaz implies that Job is sinning. He argues that the innocent do not perish, and that the upright are not cut off. Therefore, Job must be sinning greatly. He said, whoever perished being innocent or upright. We might ask Eliphaz, have you never heard of the righteous Abel who was killed by his brother Cain? Genesis 4, verse 8. His argument's faulty. Many people hold the doctrine that people who are suffering are guilty of sinning. However, this is not always the case. Eliphaz was wrong, and this doctrine of suffering will be refuted in the book to follow. The words cut off are also rendered as destroyed in other versions, being cut off or destroyed, so as to perish. Verse 8, even as I've seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. Eliphaz says that he has observed those people who plow iniquity and those who sow trouble, and how they reap the same. And so plow iniquity, you reap iniquity. Sow trouble, you reap trouble. And so you have this agricultural description of plowing and sowing. In this case, however, he speaks metaphorically, not of plowing soil and sowing seeds in the soil, but plowing iniquity and sowing trouble. And so those who do these things will reap those things. It's true that we reap what we sow. In the New Testament, Paul used the same expression. We do reap what we sow, though not always in this life, sometimes in the life to come. However, it is not true that all suffering is the reaping of sin. The suffering of Job did not require or demand the conclusion that he was sinning. Yes, Job was suffering. That's true. It's undeniable. However, to conclude that he was sinning greatly so as to deserve what he was receiving is incorrect. Verse 9, by the blast of God they perish, and by the breath of his anger they are consumed. It's true that God judges the wicked. However, the suffering of Job does not mean that he is being judged by God. This word blast may also be translated as breath. And so by the blast or the breath of God. So the idea of God judging and that people perishing. Verse 10. Of course, by the blast of God, by his anger, his wrath, they are consumed. Verse 10, he said, the roaring of the lion, the voice of the fierce lion, and the teeth of the young lions are broken. Eliphaz uses the lion as a metaphor for the wicked. Even though the wicked may be as strong as the lion, they will be consumed by God. Job 4 and verse 9. One might picture a roaring lion, a fierce lion. Here he concludes the verse 10 by saying the teeth of the young lions are broken, and so unable to feed. Verse 11, the old lion perishes for lack of prey, and the cubs of the lioness are scattered. He says that the wicked will perish, as does the lion. Looking at this metaphor of the lion, it may be that Eliphaz had in mind Job and his family. That seems reasonable. He might have thought of the young lions in verse 10 or the cubs in verse 11 as Job's children. He may have looked at the old lion, verse 11, as Job, and the lioness as Job's wife, here in verse 11. And so here we see this rebuke, veiled rebuke against Job, here in verses 7 to 11. Now, verses 12 to 21, we see Eliphaz's vision. We're not talking about his sight. Verses 12 to 21. Verse 12, now a word was secretly brought to me, and my ear received a whisper of it. Secretly, whisper. These terms seem to make it more mysterious. Eliphaz supports his argument, as we saw in the previous passages, with a vision. He claims that a word was brought to him and that he heard a whisper of the word. And so these visions, verse 13, these revelations, and so these things being revealed to him. And so he claims that this word was secretly brought to him, that he heard a whisper of this word. What about the origin of the visions or the vision? We might ask Eliphaz, if we had the opportunity, who brought the word to him? Who revealed it to him? Surely he's not claiming that God brought the word to him, that God revealed it to him. The main thought of the vision itself really has nothing to do with Job. He's incorrect. And we'll see that in the passage. In verses 12 to 16, first he describes the vision. And in verses 17 to 21, then he reveals what was said by the voice. Verse 13, in disquieting thoughts from the visions of the night, when deep sleep falls on men, fear came upon me and trembling, which made all my bones shake. And so these disquieting thoughts came from visions. These visions occurred during the night while he was sleeping. These are things that he saw while he was asleep. The term visions is found 4 times here in the book of Job. Job 4:13, 7:14, 20 in verse 8, and 33 and 15. Elihu, another person later mentioned, used similar words in his discussion. Job 33:15, in a dream, in a vision of the night, when deep sleep falls upon men while slumbering on their beds. And so here we see that he had these the thoughts from the visions or from this dream. Verse 14. Fear came upon me, and trembling, which made all my bones shake. And so here he describes how fear and trembling came upon him, upon Eliphaz. He was shaking with fear, even to his bones. And so the idea here made all my bones shake, the idea that it shook him to the core. He was really afraid. Verse 15, then a spirit passed before my face. The hair on my body stood up. Eliphaz says that in these visions that there was a spirit that passed before his face. He said that it caused the hair on his body to stand up. The idiom, make one's hair stand on end, means to cause fright, to be afraid. Job 4 and 14, we see the fear that came upon him. This term spirit in this passage may also be translated wind or air or breath in the book of Job. However, in this context, spirit seems to be the best translation. Again, he's afraid, and so there's the picture of him seeing this vision, perhaps a apparition, some kind of form appears before him, and it causes him to be afraid. Verse 16, it stood still, but I could not discern its appearance. And so the spirit stood still, but Eliphaz could not make out its appearance or its form. It took some visible form, and there was silence. He then heard a voice speak from the silence, from out of the silence. Verses 17 to 21, we see the voice. Can a mortal be more righteous than God? Can a man be more pure than his maker? And so finally we hear the voice, the revelation, the word given. Certainly it's true that a mortal cannot be more righteous than God. And yes, it's true that a man cannot be more pure than his maker. However, Job never claimed to be more righteous or more pure than God. He never did. Job never said that he was sinless before God either. We know from Genesis that God is our maker. And we know from the scriptures that God is righteous, that God is pure. Man may be righteous or pure, but not in the same sense as God, as being flawlessly righteous and pure. Some explain more than in this passage as meaning before. And so can a mortal be righteous before God? Can a man be pure before his maker? Mortal man is certainly not flawlessly pure and without sin. That's true. But looking at the passage, can a mortal be more righteous than God? Job never claimed anything of the sort. Sure, he cursed his birth. He was suffering in affliction, but he never cursed. He didn't curse God. Certainly didn't curse him to his face, and he didn't ever claim to be more righteous or more pure than God, his maker. Verse 18. If he puts no trust in his servants, if he charges his angels with error, how much more those who dwell in houses of clay, whose foundation is in the dust, who are crushed before moth? Verse 18, in the context, God's servants are his angels. Many times in Hebrew poetry, you'll see parallels between the first and the second part of the passage, as in this verse here in verse 18. Even as servants, his angels are not righteous or pure before him, as he charges them with error. We see in the passage, verse 18. In the New Testament, 2 Peter 2 and verse 4 and Jude 1 and verse 6, we see that there's record of angels sinning. And so it is true that not even angels are without error. Angels sin. In those passages, we see angels falling in sin as to be separate from God and be judged. In this particular passage, he's making the argument based on this vision that even the angels are not without error. Blameless and upright. You might remember those words. Those words were said of Job. As readers of the book, we have information not available to Job or to his friends. We have an advantage. We see the things that are going on behind the scenes. The writer of the book said that Job was blameless and upright and one who feared God and shunned evil. Job 1 and 1. Book begins speaking about Job, commending him for his blamelessness and his uprightness. Twice the Lord God himself said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil?" And so Job 1:8 and Job 2 and 3, both passages, the Lord speaking to Satan commends Job as his servant, and how that his servant is blameless and upright. And so here, and you notice that he's saying of Job, Eliphaz is saying of Job, insinuating that he has sinned. Can a mortal be more righteous than God? Can a man be more pure than his maker? We know that Job is said by God himself, though Eliphaz does not know, that Job is upright, and Job is blameless. Not that he's sinless, but that he is blameless, that he does fear him, that he does turn from evil, shun evil. Verse 19. Oh, and to point out, the same word translated servants in verse 18 is the same word translated servant in those two passages where God commends Job, his servant, to Satan. He puts no trust in his servants. Well, surely God thought very highly of Job. He commended him very highly. Verse 19. How much more those who dwell in houses of clay, whose foundation is in the dust, who are crushed before him off? The argument is that since God charges angels, even angels, with sin, with error, Job 4:18, then how much more does he charge mortals with error? First, mortal men are described as those who dwell in houses of clay and whose foundation is in the dust. Yes, men may build houses out of clay in which to live, and the foundations of those clay houses are the earth. However, it appears here that this may refer to how God formed man of the dust of the ground and how man will return to the dust. Dust you are, and to dust you shall return. Genesis 2:7 and Genesis 3:19. Second, mortal men are crushed before him off. This may describe how men are crushed as easily as a moth, describing again the frailty of man. Mortal, meaning that one can die. Verse 20. They are broken in pieces from morning till evening. They perish forever with no one regarding. Mortal men are frail. Yes, that's true. They are broken daily like clay pottery, he says in the vision. They perish forever without anyone ever noticing. Very sad to consider. Verse 21. Does not their own excellence go away? They die even without wisdom. And so Eliphaz concludes the chapter. He continues with his speech in the next chapter. Here in verse 21, we see that the excellence of mortal men goes away with their death, according to the vision of Eliphaz. They die without wisdom. Other versions read differently in this passage. Is not their tent cord plucked up from within them? And this, if the case, describes the precarious life of man being like a tent held up by a cord. And so if this is correct, then it shows again the frailty, the precarious nature of man. However, in our version here, does not their own excellence go away? And so he makes the point that the excellence, whatever excellent things in a man's life, go away with his death. They die without wisdom. Now, he'll continue with the next chapter, his speech to Job. We hope that this has been helpful for you today in studying this book. And we hope that you continue to learn on your own as you seek God's word. Thank you for being here today. And again, Lord willing, we'll see you in the future.